Et c'est la rencontre d'autrice avec Ali Cobby Eckermann, accompagné du coup à la modération par Vaine Ahura Rurua. Donc c'est la thématique écrire pour faire ressentir. Je laisse la parole à nos deux intervenantes.
Yorana, Yorana Tatot Farir Aitemhana. Comme Hirani l'a dit, je suis Vaine Ahura Rurua. Je suis archéologue, chercheuse en archéologie à l'université de Polynésie française. J'ai été très surprise de recevoir l'invitation à découvrir Ali, étant donné que je ne suis moi-même ni autrice ni critique littéraire. Mais nous l'avons reçue à Montréal. Elle a voulu rencontrer ce qu'on va dire de manière très... peut-être... elle voulait rencontrer les personnes locales, voilà. Et donc... lire l'association qui met en place ici, ce salon du livre, nous a contactés pour la recevoir depuis le week-end dernier. Donc on a eu le temps de préparer cette rencontre que je lui ai proposé d'axer sur la construction de l'identité en contexte chez les aborigènes, justement, puisque nous-mêmes sur le territoire, nous nous posons beaucoup de questions sur la construction de notre propre identité. Donc je trouvais que c'était intéressant de voir comment les aborigènes d'Australie, et notamment via le vécu de Ali, comment cette démarche peut se faire. Et je remercie Ali parce que c'est un témoignage très intime, finalement, que de vouloir livrer cette expérience et cette expérience qu'elle a vécue également lors de l'écriture de ses œuvres. Alors, pour ma première question, nous, les Polynésiens, nous avons une façon de nous présenter et d'engager la conversation. Par exemple, on va évoquer nos généalogies. Alors, pour être très, très poli, je vais très raccourcir en ce qui me concerne. Notre famille, on dit qu'elle vient d'une femme esprit qui habite le mont Rotui. Donc, le mont Rotui que tu as visité le week-end dernier à Montréal. Et d'ailleurs, ici, tu peux voir une pierre dressée, juste là, qui vient de Montréal, que mes parents ont déposée lors du festival de l'an 2000, du Festival des Arts, qui était destiné à réunir l'ensemble des archipels autour d'un même thème, qui est être ensemble pour évoquer l'art et avec les identités très particulières des archipels. Voilà, j'ai fini pour ma part. Maintenant, on va parler de toi. Ali, est-ce que là d'où tu viens, il y a un code particulier pour se présenter? Et si tu ne peux pas trop nous le dire, présente-toi dans la manière dont tu le souhaites.
Thank you. There is a cultural protocol that we follow in Australia before we introduce ourselves, and that I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners, the original owners of this country who were here before colonisation. My name is Ali Cobby Eckermann. Cobby is my Aboriginal family surname that they inherited somehow, and Eckermann is my adopted family name, because I am a survivor of the stolen generation. So as a baby, I was removed from my family, and I grew up with a German Lutheran family. So that complicates my introduction. I did meet my mother when I was 34, so proudly I can say I am a Yankunytjatjara woman. Yankunytjatjara, people from the desert, south of Uluru. My grandmother was born there. My mother was born in further south at an old mission called Aldia, but that was on Gulgitha land, not our traditional land. And I was born in Adelaide, sort of like in an orphanage place, and that is, again, not my traditional land. That is Kaurna country, and I live in the mid-north of South Australia on Ngadjuri country, again, which is not my traditional land. But that's the Ngadjuri country, or that area, is where I grew up as with my adopted family. So I'm quite familiar with that country, and it knows me, and sometimes it speaks. But part of our genealogy, which I think is becoming more important to talk about and maybe start naming, because I think we've come to a place in Australia where we've got to identify our own terms of identity, is whether you're from the desert, whether you're coastal, whether you're saltwater people, whether you're inland living on a big river, then you're freshwater people, whether you're from the tropics, whether you're from the mountains, whether you live on flat plain country that is not desert, because the environment also has an impact on our heritage and our lineage and the way that we see the world.
Merci beaucoup, Ali. C'est un beau résumé de la manière dont vous pouvez vous présenter. Tu es poète. Tu as à ton actif plusieurs œuvres, dont 3 œuvres qui ont déjà reçu des prix prestigieux. Peux-tu nous en dire plus sur ces 3 œuvres et les chemins qui t'ont mené à leur écriture?
Another part of my story is that when I was a teenager, I was not allowed to keep my firstborn child. So I was 34 when I found my mother. It was so emotional to cross the floor at the airport and walk into this mirror of myself. If you've ever had that experience, you know that my mother had my eyes, or more probably, truthfully, I had her eyes, and seeing your eyes in another person is just incredible. And 4 years later, my son was turning 18, and so I could sign the paperwork to start the journey for him. So it was very emotional times. I did creative writing because I needed to do something with all this emotion and to keep myself healthy. And I had been doing photography and painting, but this time I was doing creative writing. I never expected anything like awards, or I never thought it would really go outside the family. And the awards are almost like a miracle of knowing that your work is being read and reaching far beyond your imagination of where your works can arrive. And but you know, the other award is like when you're at the service station and there's a 16-year-old girl behind you who says, "Here, miss, I never read books, but I read your book and it was a good one." Because part of the gift of writing is that I often write for my quite wounded teenage self. I was a very unhappy teenager. I wasn't fitting into the world, and there was no answers to why I was feeling like that. So when other teenagers now can pick up a book and sort of find themselves in there, embed themselves a little bit in the story, because being removed from your family is not a rare story in Australia. The Stolen Generations has probably removed 500,000 children from their families, perhaps even more. They still continue to do it under the Welfare Act. They don't invest in the repair of families as they take and take and take. They just invest in the removal. And so my mother was quite pivotal in Canberra for reconciliation in Australia, and for people to know about the Stolen Generations. That was around the time there was a Royal Commission called the Bringing Them Home Report. quite a pivotal time. That was around the time that I was meeting her. There was, I don't know, quite a lot of recommendations that the government was asked to follow from that Royal Commission, and they, you know, adopted about 7. They don't listen to their own advice that they invest in. They're not very good business people. And as I moved further and further out into the desert, as I was meeting my traditional people, we also had a thing called the NTER, Northern Territory Emergency Response. So it was a last-ditch effort by Prime Minister John Howard, who was not our favourite Prime Minister, and he sent the army into the communities in the Northern Territory because a report had been done that became out of context, that all Aboriginal men were abusing their wives and children. And the slander of that and the effect that it had on Aboriginal men was really severe. And living out there at the time, you could soon see that it was another attempt at land grabbing and disempowering communities. So that's another thing in Australia. It's another trick to always be observant for, that you're allowed to repair to a certain level and then the government will come and bring you down again. And we always seems to be doing this. And they also control the funds. So it was at that time there was a knock on the back door, and I opened it, and there was a big group of men, and I got such a shock I slammed the door shut. And I opened it again and I said, what do you want? And they said, Ali, we want you to stand up for us and start talking for us. And so then my writing took another curve, because then there was a lot of purpose. There was a request from the people to, yeah. There was one uncle, and he was a traditional man, and he was like a shaman. And him and several others of our nunkaries, we call them, they spent a lot of time with me because I was quite damaged by the removal, and they wanted to quieten down the mess that was living inside me so that I could start listening to culture. And he always used to tease me, "You're good now, girl, go get the world." He would do a healing and he would always say that, and he would just laugh. He was this handsome Aboriginal cowboy. He always had the hat and the flash shirt, and he always had the lovely smile on his face. And he was killed suddenly in a car accident. It's quite remarkable that when the Wyndham Campbell Prize was awarded for poetry at Yale University for the first time, that I was the first Indigenous poet in the world to receive that. And I was standing there and they were starting to read my bio, and I quickly kicked my shoes off and I was standing there and I felt the spirit of this beautiful man whisper in my ear, "You're good now, girl. Go get the world." Yeah. So being true to truth, being an adult child learner of my culture, listening to every word that those old people told me to try and catch up for 34 years that was missing in my life. That was a wonderful reward of also their support for my writing.
Merci Ali. Oui, effectivement, quand on parcourt ta biographie, on apprend que tu fais partie de la génération volée, justement, qui renvoie à une période vraiment très tragique de l'histoire de ton pays. Alors, tu viens de nous donner quelques indications, mais pour ceux dans le public qui ne connaissent pas vraiment ce que c'est, est-ce que tu peux expliquer très brièvement ce qu'est la génération volée dont tu fais partie?
It was such an exciting time in Australia. If you Google the Bringing Them Home report or reconciliation in Australia around 1994, I think it was, thousands of Australians were walking across the Sydney Harbour Bridge. Everyone was marching in every state and every capital city. Australia was demanding the change for reconciliation. I remember I wasn't in Sydney. I was with my auntie, who I was supposed to grow up with. That's why I know I was stolen, because 2 uncles went away and worked when I was in my mother's stomach and in her womb. And they went away shearing and they sent money back, and there was a trust fund so that my auntie, my mother's cousin, would look after me, her and uncle, and I would grow up with my cousins so my mother could finish her nursing degree, because this was quite a pivotal time in Australia where Aboriginal people were allowed to educate and hold these roles. So it was very important for Mum to finish being a nurse. And anyway, I didn't make it. I didn't make it to her place. They tell me that the empty pram sat in the kitchen for about 2 weeks before my uncle went and just put it in the shed and smashed it up, because they never knew where the baby had gone. So I was sitting with her when we were watching these thousands, and we turned on the TV and people were walking over the bridge. We went shopping and we came back hours later and people were still working on the bridge. She was crying. We'd never seen anything like this in Australia. It's really worth Googling. The Bringing Them Home report, reconciliation march on the bridge. The Prime Minister, John Howard, said that the Stolen Generations was a lie. It didn't exist. And so there was a lot of hope that was lost.
Alors, beaucoup plus tard dans ta vie, tu as recontacté ta famille. Qu'est-ce qui s'est passé les quelques années qui ont suivi ta rencontre avec ta propre famille? Est-ce que tu as cherché à redécouvrir ta culture de départ? Et comment est-ce que tu as engagé la réappropriation de ton histoire?
I think there's a good story to share. So after meeting Mum, and I also want to say that I kept a good relationship with my adopted mother. So for a short time, I was a bit spoilt. I had 2 mums. But it was the call for the desert. And I was studying photography at Arts College, at Aboriginal Arts College, and I got asked to go out into the desert to do a commission of a remote school and take photographs, document 2 weeks at this school. And I was out there and people were looking at me and running away, and more people would come and they would look at me and they'd run away. And I was a little terrified that I'd done something wrong, because I was learning culture and I didn't know. I've written a poem about it, and 3 days later, they all come back. This is, I can't even describe how remote this place is. It's like 2 full days driving into the desert. It's a little school between 2 communities. And maybe there's 50 people in each community. The most beautiful, remote desert country. And they came back in 3 days and they said, "We just got a shock when we seen you. You've got your grandmother's face." And that was the start of the journey. The old people welcoming my family back on traditional country because I had my grandmother's face. Those old people they're so astute, and they don't see things in one lifetime. One old man said, "Oh, it's so lovely that you're back. We wondered where you'd got to." And I don't know whether he was talking to my grandmother or my great-grandmother. I don't think he was talking to me. He was talking to the lineage of us. That's how it works out there, because mostly colonisation hasn't reached out there. The songs and dance haven't been stolen or disrupted. Culture has been continuing since creation, and most people know that Aboriginal Australia is the oldest living cultural continuum in the world, and definitely out in the desert, that is true.
Au cours des derniers jours que nous avons passés ensemble, tu nous as expliqué que tu n'aimes pas trop vivre en ville, dans les agglomérations. Tu as choisi de vivre loin des villes, en t'établissant dans un tout petit village, et tu as réaménagé une épicerie, une ancienne épicerie, pour en faire un lieu de retraite, pour l'écriture, pour la peinture. Est-ce que tu peux nous expliquer plus sur ce projet? Et as-tu des collègues qui passent de temps en temps avec toi dans cette maison que tu as réaménagée? Est-ce que tu accueilles des jeunes aussi? Ça peut arriver?
So I mentioned before about the NTER, the Northern Territory Emergency Response, when the army was coming into the communities and trying to establish a new set of rules, and the men and the community had asked me to start speaking up. Well, the government didn't like that, and so they... there's a saying in Australia called, like those half-caste bastards, they cause all the trouble. So light-skinned Aboriginal people, often the government doesn't regard us as true Aboriginal people. And because I was standing up, the government was spreading rumours that I had been stealing money, and they made it quite difficult for me to stay in the community with my family. So that's why I returned to South Australia, to the place where I had grown up. And I bought an old general store. I bought an old shop. And I set up Australia's first writers' retreat because I was missing everyone. I was so damn lonely. I just found my family, and the government had made it too hard for me to live there, and I had this big empty house. So it was wonderful to invite other writers into that space. We had no money. It was mattresses on the floor. Everyone cooked together. Everyone did the dishes. The dog slept with everyone. I look back now, and it was a way of creating our own community. It was very cultural in the way that we did all that sharing. And you could see that in the poetry that was coming out. Some people were writing poetry for the first time, scrunching it up, like read it, perform it, and then throw it in the fire and walk out like a king or queen the next day, because what they had managed to extract some pain and be free of it. So that was really good. I did really expect a government department to come and have a chat and see how they could support that, but they never came. I think it's very vital, and it was so wonderful to be heard in my request to stay with a traditional or Indigenous family, and my time with the Rurua family was priceless. My heart will leave filled with fun and love. Yeah, it was exactly what I because colonisation often stops us from having our own space. And in the sadness of trying to re-establish something like leaving my family again with the writers' retreat, we did that. We still don't have our own university. We don't have our own churches. There are a couple of tiny Aboriginal schools that exist. And I mentioned even Aboriginal Arts College. It's not run, it's a place where Aboriginal students gather. Most of the teachers are non-Indigenous. Our health clinics are a Western system. And so, any Aboriginal people are welcome to come and stay, and, you know, because we have our own way of interacting that is fairly seamless, and we know each other's trauma. We've got a wicked sense of humour that we often can't share in public because it might be seen as a little bit confrontational, but it's hilarious. People that are deeply traumatised have an amazing sense of humour because you have to.
Justement, tu nous as expliqué la semaine dernière que chaque année, tu retrouves ta famille dans le désert pour vivre ta culture, pour partager du temps avec ta communauté. Peux-tu nous en dire plus sur cette expérience?
It's really important to connect, go back to the desert and connect with the traditional family. And one of those reasons is I was getting quite good at learning language when I lived up there. And the last time I went back, I was just horrified how much I've lost. Because when you're listening to language all the time, I don't know, even if you're not speaking it, it's living in your mind. I remember people would say, question my Aboriginal writing because I wasn't fluent in language, but I was very fluent in thinking Yankunytjatjara, because when I was meeting my family, I observed everything. You're a very good student at 34 years of age, not easily distracted. And so I can't stress the importance of investment to keep original language strong. It does something, it moves you, it does something inside your body that it is also a bit hard to articulate. But in 7 years' time, that will be the time when I will have lived half my life not knowing who I was, and half my life as a Yankunytjatjara woman. And so I know what it means not to have it. You are a weaker person without knowing language, without knowing story. And in Australia, we have the song lines because our island is such a big island. And so the song lines travel through like travel tracks and maps across the country. So every language group would own like a verse of the song, and a lot of information would be in that verse. So you had to be, you know, respectful and to be guided through their country because the information you needed was in that song, and then the next, and then the next verse. So going back to traditional country makes me strong in my verse.
Est-ce que tu peux nous en dire plus sur la vie des aborigènes dans le désert? Parce que ici, comme tu le vois, on est entouré d'eau. Le monde du désert, on ne connaît pas trop. Peux-tu nous dire comment on y vit, comment on s'y adapte et qu'est-ce qu'on y fait?
I would say one of our favourite pastimes is eating the tail of the kangaroo. There are so many kangaroos in Australia that they have like a abattoir, a factory where people go and shoot them and It is very good meat, and it's our traditional meat. And they, at the abattoir, they chop the tails off and put it in a plastic bag, and you can go to the supermarket and buy it frozen from the frozen department. Also, sometimes I've seen that frozen tail makes a very good weapon in an argument because it's very solid when it's frozen. But so there's a lot of time in the desert spent going out bush. We have these small communities. They still have white management. The houses are usually overcrowded in the desert, especially in the communities. I don't think any Aboriginal people own their home. It's all managed by the government. We are quite a good industry for the government. And I know there's one community that has taken the government to court because the government aren't repairing the homes, and the homes are living in squalor. I think it's hard to imagine how Australia markets itself as quite a rich, fun, intelligent, happy place, the lucky country. A lot of my family in the desert live in poverty, and that's hard to see on the visits. A lot of the houses don't have a fridge. So most of the time, every chance you get, you go out bush and you look for bush tucker, because everything has a bush equivalent. Bush orange, bush banana, bush plum, bush onion. If you find the goanna or the nintucker, and it's a large lizard, they're exciting days. The small lizards, yeah. Everything's pretty tasty out in the desert. You've got to have good eyes to be able to find it, though. Yeah, the children are amazing. They have amazing eyes.
On va passer à la dernière question avant de passer le micro au public. La dernière question que moi j'avais, que je vais te poser maintenant, c'est finalement, est-ce que les aborigènes vivent en marge des villes? Est-ce que certains vivent dans les villes? Et est-ce que finalement, le fait d'écrire tes émotions dans tes romans a déjà participé à motiver des aborigènes d'aujourd'hui à évoquer leurs traumas, à dénoncer ce qu'ils ont vécu et même à avoir des messages d'espoir?
Yeah, I think understanding Aboriginal Australia is very complicated. We have quite successful people who have had high levels of education and have reached quite high up in public servants or even some in government and even in their own businesses. And so there'll be every level between quite wealthy and the very poor. You mentioned genealogy before, so I think it's important to state too that prior to the British, there's proof that the French, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the Dutch, and definitely Indonesia and Papua, we'd all had relationships, long-term relationships with these other countries. It was the British that brought the war of colonisation. They came with a set plan to invade our land. They made the statement of terra nullius, saying that it was empty land, that people didn't live there, even when they were killing us. And the first wave of impact happened on the east coast. So there was a lot more documentation of families on those side, and some of those families are the leaders in university and in success. And I would say Stan Grant and his family are a wonderful example, and Christian has published Stan Grant in the publishing house. My family is a little different, because before my grandmother there's no record of our family. We were very tribal, Aboriginal people in the desert who didn't come in and didn't mix with white people. My grandmother was a claimant for a particular section of land, and then she vanished off the road in 1976, and so someone removed her name off that claim. So I have no claim to land. There is the purpose of a lot of people doing decolonisation work, being very brave, going in, investigating the archives that have been kept away from us for a very long time. They're doing really good work. But really, the thing I believe that will strengthen Aboriginal people, and instead of us being stretched across this big, don't know what the word, being in that big description or that big difference, is cultural education, to bring us back more closer. So like in the old days, we all had our land, but we were all respectful and equal in our culture.
Merci Ali.
On applaudit, ne soyez pas timide, vous avez le droit d'applaudir. On va poser des questions. Si vous avez envie de faire des interventions ou de poser des questions à Ali, n'hésitez pas. On vous laisse ce laps de temps pour ça. Et si vous n'en avez pas, on peut laisser nos deux intervenantes continuer jusqu'à l'issue de cet échange. Comme ils sont intimidés, tu peux continuer encore un petit peu.
Ok. Alors, comme le public n'a pas de questions, moi j'en ai encore une. Ah. Finalement,
tout d'abord, je voudrais dire le plaisir que j'ai eu à lire votre livre 3 fois et que je relirai souvent. Et je voudrais vous poser une question, peut-être un peu iconoclaste, vu ce qu'on a dit depuis une demi-heure. J'espère qu'elle ne sera pas incongrue, même si elle est un peu européo-centrée. Estimez-vous que dans la construction de votre prise de conscience individuelle et d'appartenance collective, il y a une part de culture allemande dont vous n'avez pas dit un mot et qui a quand même baigné toute la formation intellectuelle de votre réflexion?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I mentioned that I grew up on a farm, and so I learnt how to grow food. As a child, we had access to lots of nature. And as a kid that was forced to go to church quite a lot, I learnt the morals of those Bible stories, because the adopted family that grew me up had very good morals. They weren't hypocrites. Dad and his brothers and the families and the cousins and whatever, we sort of had this maybe idyllic time. And there was 9 adopted kids in that family. So we were also a bit bizarre. When I met my Aboriginal family and we were going out looking for bush food, it's a different way of gardening, of growing food. It's a lot of time in nature. And culture teaches you very good morals. I did see the similarity between the two families despite vast differences. And so when I'm writing, I do have a consideration for my adopted family, because I still love my adopted family. I don't really like white Australia, but I haven't lost the respect for my adopted family. And as trying to be, that does play in my intelligence as a writer. It's a good little measure, because I could write, well, I do write very, very angry writings that I've placed around the house just for people to find when I pass away, just to go, oh my God, what is this? But that's my sense of humour. I would never publish it in public because it would serve no purpose. And I think my adopted father especially was a very smart, emotional, intelligent man. And then again, I saw the replication of that when I met my old people out in the desert, how absolutely astute with emotional intelligence they were. Yeah.
D'accord, merci.
Est-ce qu'il y a d'autres questions ou du coup...
There is a big difference though. The Germans don't cry. They're very protected with their emotions. A lot of the German family had missionary backgrounds. And it was such a blessing when I got out to the desert and met my Aboriginal family, how important it was for me too. They had to teach me how to cry. I hadn't cried for, I hadn't cried for 27 years. And then when they sort of started that healing process, then I couldn't stop crying for about 3 years. I was so sick of crying. But at the end of that, I felt so much healthier. And I think we live at a pace where we forget to look after our emotions. And the other thing that they really taught me, which was another thing I had access to as a girl on the farm, was like, I call it sitting looking at the sky. It's time to just sit with yourself, to listen to nature. If you keep practicing that, I mean, like, people say, oh, we don't have the time for that. We work really hard. I'm not saying you have to do it for a day, but if you did 5-10 minutes every day and you did that for, a long time, even in the practice of that, you start hearing a little bit differently. You start knowing yourself a little bit differently. Tears will just spring to your eyes and sometimes you don't understand. But this is a healthy lifestyle. Again, I know the difference between a healthy lifestyle for me and an unhealthy lifestyle.
Merci. Tu peux poser ta dernière question du coup et on finira là-dessus.
Du coup, pour clôturer.
Ah ok. Bon, applaudissez bien fort s'il vous plaît.
J'allais dire pour...
Ah, pour clôturer, excuse-moi. Je t'ai pas entendu. Vas-y.
Can I just add, I've listened to some discussions here over the last few days. It's been very, very interesting for me. There's many parallels here about the problems that have been discussed and the problems back in Australia. And I just want to say, with the utmost respect, it's very important to invest in your traditional original people. Because if you don't, if you lose that, the land will become very sad and you will always live in a sad place. Indigenous people around the world are the very thing that brings joy, because we belong to the land doesn't belong to us. And taking us out of that earthen picture brings big sadness. Most of my friends and other people on Facebook and whatever, we're feeling this huge sadness in Australia. Not looking forward to going home. I really want to thank everyone who's been kind to me in my visit here, because it's a big burden to live with so much sadness when you're almost afraid to go out of your front door, and it's just everywhere. The government's not. The government says it's supporting Indigenous people, but the money doesn't go to the places to make it effective. They own the funding. They have forked tongues. And we have the people, the young people in Alice Springs and in Kalgoorlie and whatever, smashing up the place too. It's really come to a point. I just want to say that it's your decision about independence. Australia, as Aboriginal Australians, we've lost our chance at independence. We'll never have it. We're only 5% of the population. So we have to live with this. But you have a chance to do something good, to keep the happiness in this beautiful country, because you don't want to risk what we're suffering in Australia. Thank you.